Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second of our series of 6 classes on music inspired by the natural world. So let me share my screen with you and we can get started. The last time, here we go. Can you see that? The last time we talked about music inspired by, here we go. Music inspired by mountains and seas, you might recall. And this time we're going to talk about music inspired by other aspects of the natural world. And again, this is the second of 2 classes on music inspired by the earth. And then in the third and fourth class sessions, we're going to talk about music inspired by plants. And then in the last 2 class sessions, we'll get to music inspired by animals. So what we're talking about today, or right now, is music, for some reason, my PowerPoint keeps changing without my asking it to. We're going to talk first about music inspired by islands. And I want to start with the composer Maurice Ravel and some excerpts from his wonderful score for the ballet Dagenais et Chloé in 1912. Maurice Ravel was one of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century composers, which falls under that umbrella of Impressionism, an impressionistic composer then. We talked a bit about that last time, but this is a group of composers, the 2 primary members of which were Ravel and Debussy, whom we heard of from our last course, and we're going to have some more excerpts from Debussy later in this class. But Impressionism in the musical sense sort of is similar to Impressionism in a artistic sense. Because artists were really the first people to be known as Impressionists beginning in the late 19th century, when artists like Manet and Monet and Van Gogh and others began painting pictures which were a little bit vague and a little bit fuzzy and intended to give sort of an impression of the thing they were painting. And the same thing happened in music, where Impressionistic composers wrote this music which sort of washes over you very gently. It's not very stark, dramatic music typically. It doesn't depict things very specifically, but it's sort of to give you an impression of something. And this ballet takes place on the island of Lesbos off Greece, and so it's set in an island, which is what gives us excuse to listen to some Maurice Ravel now. I want to mention a couple things. In both of these excerpts, you will note the use of a chorus, but the chorus isn't speaking any words. They're just sort of speaking nonsense syllables. And this was a innovation developed by Debussy a bit earlier and was subject to much criticism by musicians at the time who felt that it was very weird to have a chorus not singing any words. But it became pretty popular among Impressionist composers and has been used many, many times since. So you'll hear that in both these excerpts. And then in the second excerpt, some pirates arrive on the island, and I think you're going to be able to tell that. That's clearly going to be the most exciting thing you're going to listen to in these excerpts, but mostly just sort of let the music wash over you, because you're supposed to get an impression of something rather than a detailed sound picture. And here's the second one. Well, that's a little bit of Maurice Ravel. Next, I want to listen to some music by Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn is one of my favorite composers, a wonderful composer, German composer of the early 1800s. Mendelssohn actually came from a prominent Jewish family in Leipzig. His great-grandfather was Moses Mendelssohn, a very famous figure in the history of rabbinical Judaism, as some of you might know. His family, his father and his mother actually converted to Christianity, and he ended up being a composer who incorporated some Christian themes into some of his music. But that's not relevant to what we're talking about now. He visited Scotland, and at the age of 23 wrote an overture called the Hebrides Overture, which is, an overture is kind of a short symphony in one movement, you might think of it that way, about the Hebrides Islands. Mendelssohn was a phenomenally talented composer from a young age. His story rivals that of Mozart. He was an accomplished keyboard artist when he was still 5 years old, and began playing other instruments when he was 7 or 8, composing before he was 10, conducted orchestras when he was in his teens, was a well-known composer by the time he was 16. I mean, you know, just one of these amazing child prodigies. And although he had a short life, as you can see here, it was an extremely productive one, and he left lots of wonderful music. So here's an example of his orchestral music, the overture inspired by the Hebrides Islands off the coast of Scotland. By the way, Mendelssohn is a person to whom we owe a great debt. He was something of a musical archaeologist, if you will. And he was aware that a couple of generations before his time, there was a wonderful organist in the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig by the name of Johann Sebastian Bach, who composed a few things. But Bach had been almost completely forgotten after his own lifetime. And Mendelssohn felt that Bach must have written a lot more music than that. And so with the consent of the church fathers, he was able to go back at the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig and do some excavations. And he found hidden away in the music library, tucked away between pages of books and things like that, dozens and dozens of manuscript of wonderful compositions by Bach. And so he brought these out and began programming them on concerts that he conducted. And as a result, Bach was rediscovered and became a very famous composer internationally, and now is considered, of course, to be one of the 2 or 3 greatest composers who ever lived. But Bach might well have been completely forgotten by us if it had not been for Mendelssohn. And so we owe him a double dose of thanks, not only for writing wonderful music on his own, but for rescuing the reputation of one of the greatest composers of all time, Bach. Well, let's turn to rivers, because there's lots of interesting music that's been written about rivers. Last time I gave you or I brought to you an excerpt from Bedřich Smetana, the Czech composer, from his great work called Ma Vlast, or My Fatherland. I pointed out last time that Smetana is one of the 3 great composers of Czechoslovakia. It's a country not known by that name anymore. It was known as Bohemia in his day, and we would now call it the Czech Republic. But in his day, it was Bohemia. And he had lots of excerpts from this wonderful piece of music called Ma Vlast about natural features of the landscape of his own country. And the most popular of those is the Moldau, which portrays the major river that runs through Czechoslovakia, or Bohemia. Let's listen to this now. It's one of the greatest pieces of music ever written, I think. Again, I recommend to you Ma Vlast. The whole thing is beautiful, and it's a great example of 19th century music. Well, now I want to bring you the very beginning of Wagner's great series of 4 operas called the Ring Cycle. Wagner was the major German composer of operas in the 19th century, and as you can see, his career spanned most of the century. And his greatest accomplishment by far was a remarkable series of 4 operas which tell a single story. So there's a prologue and then a 3-part story of these, based upon ancient medieval legends from Germany of gods and forests and dwarves and giants and all the rest. So it's a wonderful adventure story, which, by the way, was the inspiration for Tolkien's series of novels, The Fellowship of the Ring. But going back to Wagner's Ring Cycle, I want to play you the very beginning of the cycle because it starts with some gold which has been hidden in the River Rhine. And so this is his musical depiction at the very beginning of the first opera of the four of the River Rhine. Now, I will tell you before we listen to this that this has won fame in music as being the longest E-flat chord ever written. It goes on for over 200 measures. But that sounds really boring, but it's really not, because if you listen to this, I think you can hear the ebb and flow of the River Rhine. So let's listen to just the first couple of minutes of the Ring Cycle by Wagner. So if you're interested in Wagner's Ring Cycle, there's another 16 hours of music that follows this. Actually, we will hear some more excerpts from the Ring Cycle later in this course, and so we'll hear some more of the music of Wagner. Well, speaking of rivers, of course, we can't get by without playing some excerpts from The Beautiful Blue Danube by Johann Strauss II. Just a word about Johann Strauss II. We call him the second because his father, the first, was actually the first in this remarkable Strauss family of composers. And it's an example. The Bach family is another example because Johann Sebastian Bach had a number of children, sons who also became famous composers. Well, here we have the Strauss family. Johann Strauss I, this Strauss's father, was a composer of waltzes and polkas and other kinds of dances, and had a very popular dance band in Vienna back in the mid-1800s. He was much in demand and did a lot of traveling and played all over Europe, really, although his home base was in Vienna. And he was a very popular dance composer and dance band conductor. Ballroom dancing was all the rage in Austria and throughout Central Europe at that time. Well, he absolutely forbid any of his children from entering into the music business because it was a business that took you away from home for a long period of time, and he felt that it was something that was not advisable, and so he asked his children to go into other ventures and forbid them even from taking up any instruments or practicing any music or listening to any music. There was one small problem, and that is that his son, Johann Strauss II, was an enormously talented musician and a prodigious musical prodigy. His mother understood that, and during one of his father's long trips, he and his mother snuck off, and his mother bought him a violin. And he would practice the violin at home when his father wasn't there, and then carefully hide it away when his father came home. And he grew up to be enchanted by music, and started his own band. He actually asked his father if he could join his father's band at one point, and his father said absolutely not. And so Johann Strauss II went out and formed his own orchestra, and went into competition with his father. His father was so upset that his son had gone into competition with him that he actually hired, believe it or not, a gang of thugs to show up at the first concert performed by Johann Strauss II's orchestra in order to disrupt the concert and to force it to be canceled. However, what happened was that the thugs who showed up began listening to the concert, and they were so totally enchanted with the music of the young man that instead of breaking up the concert, they cheered loudly and clapped loudly and hoisted Johann Strauss II on their shoulders and carried him through the crowd at the end of the concert. So not exactly performing their part of the bargain. But Johann Strauss II became enormously popular. If anything, he was even a greater composer, conductor, and violinist than his father was. Eventually, his father's band went out of business, and his father was ill and died. And so Johann Strauss II united the two orchestras into one, and it became, for many, many years, the most famous orchestra that performed dance music in all of Europe. Many imitators, of course, but never equal. He himself wrote dozens of waltzes and polkas and other sorts of dance music for the orchestra, as did some other composers. And it turned out that he had several brothers who were also quite talented, and they contributed music as well. So the whole Strauss family entered into this business with enthusiasm, and they were one of the great musical families in all of Europe. Anyway, enough introduction. You've all heard this music, but here it is. Oh, you know how the rest of that goes. I wish we had time to listen to the whole thing because it's all wonderful. Continuing with the theme of water, let's listen to some music inspired by lakes. Going back to Claude Debussy, whom we talked about a minute ago, this is a piano piece that he wrote called Reflections in the Water. And let's listen to his piano interpretation of what water would be like. Well, just a little bit about Claude Debussy's music. He wrote some wonderful piano pieces, as you can tell, in addition to lots of great orchestral music. And his piano pieces are available in sheet music for those of you who are good pianists. Why they're fun to sit down and play as well. So just an example of his idea of water, reflections in the water. Well, I now want to go to Russia and hear an excerpt from the greatest of all the Russian composers, Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. There's actually a lot of competition for that crown because there are many outstanding Russian composers that we've had over the years, but Tchaikovsky is probably the most famous of them all. Tchaikovsky was an amazing prodigy as a child. Began composing shortly after his graduation from the Moscow Conservatory, where his music was considered very avant-garde and extremely radical. We don't hear it that way at all today, but then we listen with different ears. But one of the things that he wanted to do during his lifetime is to resurrect ballet music. Ballet was very popular in Russia during his time, and it still is today. And the reason ballet music was popular, you may wonder, well, why Russia? Because ballet is, after all, a French art form, right? It was created in France, so why would people of Russia, a world removed from France, care particularly about ballet? The reason is because of Catherine the Great, who, when she became the ruler of Russia in the 1600s, wanted to import Russian court, or rather French court traditions into Russia. She thought Russia was a very backward country, which it was, and she wanted to bring Russia into the modern age. And there was nothing more modern than French, the French court and the French traditions from Paris. And so she basically imported all these ideas from France, including making French the official language of the Russian court, oddly as that seems. And one of the French traditions she brought was that of ballet. Well, the Russians fell in love with ballet. And so ballet became very popular in Russia and remains so today. But the ballet scores, the musical scores behind ballet were basically, by and large, rather pedestrian. And the idea was, if you were a composer, composing a ballet was that you wanted to write a series of short pieces. They had to be fairly short because the dancers got tired, with a very strong rhythm to them, and pieces that could be danced by a corps of dancers or by a solo dancer or by a duet, how to do, and just do whatever the choreographer needed in order to supply a musical background for the dancing. But really, the focus was the dance and not the music. And so ballet scores were, for the most part, sort of tossed off without really putting a whole lot of care and thinking into it. Tchaikovsky had an entirely different idea. He wanted the score, the musical score, to be the central part of the ballet. And while clearly the dancing is very important, no question, he wanted there to be just as much interest coming out of the orchestra pit as there was displayed on stage by the dancing. And he wrote a number of great ballet scores as a consequence, and really elevated that particular art form into a high art form. And many composers afterwards have tried to do the same thing Tchaikovsky did with ballet scores. And as a result, there are many wonderful ballet scores composed by composers who came along after Tchaikovsky. But he was the first. So let's listen to his Swan Lake, which of course takes place, after all, on a lake. So here's just a portion of that. Well, that's just a bit of Swan Lake. We'll come back and listen to much more Tchaikovsky later on in the course. From lakes, I want to now turn to a sunrise, because several composers have been inspired by the sunrise at the beginning of the day. Ferdy Grofé is an American composer who was active in the early part of the 20th century. He was primarily known as an arranger of Broadway scores. He worked on Broadway for years. He also worked with a lot of famous jazz musicians in rendering orchestrations of jazz favorites. So he was well known in the popular music field, but he also was a very fine composer in his own right. And his most famous piece of music by far is the Grand Canyon Suite. The suite being a series of short orchestral pieces arranged around a theme. And the theme, of course, here is the famous Grand Canyon in the United States. And we'll listen to more of this later on in the class, but we want to start with the very beginning of the Grand Canyon Suite, which describes in music the sunrise, the sun rising over the Grand Canyon early in the morning. little bit of Freddie Griffey's Grand Canyon Suite, a wonderful piece of music that I recommend to you. Just really one of the most lovely pieces, I think, written during the 20th century. Well, another famous piece of music which indicates a sunrise is by the German composer Richard Strauss. Now, we explored Strauss a bit last week when we heard some excerpts from his Alpine Symphony. I talked a little bit about him then. Strauss was of the generation of German composers who came along right after Richard Wagner, and he was much influenced by Wagner, but very much had his own musical language as well. And this famous piece of music is written on a theme based upon a philosophical tract by Friedrich Nietzsche, of all things. So Nietzsche was a great German philosopher and had some very interesting philosophical ideas and had enormous influence throughout much of intellectual Europe and the 19th century. And Richard Strauss was a great fan of Nietzsche, and one of Nietzsche's philosophical tracts from fairly early in his philosophical writings is "Solche sprach Zarathustra." Such spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra being an ancient philosopher from the Middle East, and Nietzsche took the theme of his book from some of the early writings of Zarathustra. And so you wouldn't think this would be a terribly exciting inspiration for a composer, but so it was for Richard Strauss, who was a great fan of Friedrich Nietzsche and was acquainted with him. I believe Nietzsche would have been older than Strauss, but Strauss probably knew him when Strauss was a young man. So this music is very famous from a movie, and I think you'll all recognize the movie, but let's play the music first. Probably all know the movie, but more importantly, it's just a wonderful piece of music. Strauss explained later on in writing more about this that he was intending by these chords to depict not only a simple sunrise, but also to depict really the dawn of humanity. So it had a much broader theme than just the rising of the sun in the morning. So that's why it's probably a bit more dramatic than you might think for music that might depict just a sunrise. Well, let's listen to some excerpts about rain. Sergei Rachmaninoff was probably one of the greatest, he was one of the greatest pianists, and he considered him to be the greatest pianist of all time. Here's his musical depiction of rain. I can just hear the raindrops splashing on the patio as that piece is playing. It's a wonderful depiction of rain, I think. Here's another example of music depicting a rather soft rain. Mark Blitzstein was a composer of operas and musicals in the mid-20th century United States. And he wrote an opera called Regina, which is based upon a novel by Lillian Hellman called The Little Foxes, which is a rather dramatic piece about a Southern family that's full of conflict and arguments and so forth. But in the middle of it, as sort of an interlude in the rather stressful scenes of the rest of the opera, he has a very gentle piece sung by 4 of the people in the opera about a gentle rain. And I think this is one of the most beautiful musical pieces, I think, depicting gentle rain. So here's an opera excerpt from Mark Blitzstein's Regina. Cute quartet, I think, from Mark Blitzstein's opera Regina. Well, of course, rain, when it gets heavier, turns into storms, and here's one of the most famous pieces of storm music ever written. This is from Gioacchino Rossini's opera, The Barber of Seville. it's wonderful how he starts out with a musical depiction of just the gentle raindrops. Then it kind of builds into a storm, and you can hear the thunder in the background. And just a great example of music by the wonderful composer Rossini. Well, I spoke last time about the fact that in the late 19th century, there was a real spirit of nationalism that swept most of Europe, and many of the countries had their own nationalist composers who wrote music that was based upon the folk songs and so forth of their own countries. And one of the greatest of those is Jan Sibelius from Finland. And he became the great Finnish composer and wrote lots of wonderful pieces, including the national anthem of Finland called Finlandia. But I want to play a different piece of music by him here. He wrote incidental music to Shakespeare's play The Tempest, which, as you know from the very name, starts out with a rainstorm, as you might know, where a bunch of people are shipwrecked on an island. And this is his incidental music to Shakespeare's play. By the way, this recording is by the Kansas City Symphony. Came out several years ago. They did a CD recording of the music from Sibelius's The Tempest. I highly recommend the CD if you don't have it. But here's a portion of Sibelius's music showing the storm from Shakespeare's Tempest. The music of Jan Sibelius from his music accompanying Shakespeare's play The Tempest. So I want to conclude today's class with 3 excerpts about the moon. Hopefully you will let me get by with playing separate excerpts about the moon, even though this is a course about music inspired by the earth, because of course the view of the moon from the earth is one of the most stunning things that all of us experience in the natural world, and a number of composers have been inspired to write music about that. The most famous, which those of you who took piano lessons in your earlier days might possibly have played, is the famous Moonlight Sonata by Ludwig van Beethoven. So let's hear, this is a piano piece, and let's hear his view of the moon, or inspired at least by the moon. So just a little bit of Beethoven's famous Moonlight Sonata. Well, I want to play again a piece of music by Claude Debussy. We visited Debussy before in this course, and we will hear from him again. But one of the most famous pieces of music about the moon is his Clair de Lune, which means Light of the Moon, which started out as a piano piece, but he later orchestrated it. And I want to talk about that for a second because it's something that happens fairly often in classical music. So you will have somebody who will write a piece for the piano or some other instrument, normally the piano. And then it'll become so popular that people will ask for an orchestrated version of it so that it can be played by a full orchestra. And so that's what happened here. This actually is part of a suite of piano pieces called the Suite Bergamesque. But this particular piece was so popular that orchestral conductors wanted to include it on their programs. And so Debussy went back and orchestrated it for a full orchestra, which means that you take the notes of the piece and assign it to different instruments. So you're going to say this particular note will be played by the violins, and this will be played by the oboe, and this will be the clarinet, and you add some percussion in, and you add more notes because, of course, an orchestra can play far more notes than a piano player could, and you come up with a much fancier version of a piece which started out as a simple piano piece. There are many examples over music history of pianists who will do this, or composers who will do this. There are also examples of composers taking other composers' piano pieces and orchestrating them. We talked a bit about Johann Sebastian Bach. Many of his pieces, which were originally written for the piano or the harpsichord or the organ, have been converted into full orchestral versions by later composers. Maurice Ravel, from whom we heard the Dagenais and Chloe at the beginning of this class, was a great orchestrator, and he oftentimes would take other composers' piano pieces and orchestrate them, most famously the music of Mussorgsky, a piece called Pictures at an Exhibition, but there are others as well. And sometimes it happens in reverse. Sometimes a orchestra piece will be so-called reduced to a piano version and played by a piano. The great pianist Franz Liszt was famous for this. He would take a symphony by Beethoven and boil it down to its essence and redo it as a piano piece and then play it on piano. So you can hear that as well. But this is an example of a piano piece that started out that way and became orchestrated by the composer himself. So here is the orchestral version of Debussy's Clair de Lune. Just a little bit of the piece Inspired by the Moon by Claude Debussy. Well, I want to finish up this class with an opera piece, but before we get to that, let's keep in mind that after this, we will stop the presentation, and I want to hear your comments and your questions and your discussion about some of the music we've had today. So you might want to think about any questions you have in preparation for the last part of the class, when we will hopefully have a discussion. But before we get there, let's listen to the last excerpt for today. And this is an opera excerpt called The Song to the Moon, one of the most famous pieces of music inspired by the moon by the great Czech composer Antonín Dvořák. I mentioned that there were three great Czech composers that we've had over history. Smetana, the composer of Mládst, was the first. Dvořák in the late 19th century, the second. And then a 20th century composer by the name of Leos Janáček was the third. And we have heard from Dvořák before, and we'll hear from him again. And we will hear from Janáček later in this course. So we'll cover all three of those great Czech composers. But this is the middle one, Dvořák. And in his wonderful opera Rusalka, which is essentially the story of the Little Mermaid, which we're familiar with because of the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale and obviously the Disney version. But this was far, far before Disney when Dvořák took this and wrote a wonderful opera based upon this character. And she sings near the beginning of the opera this song to the moon, singing of what it would like to be in love, basically. And we're going to hear it sung for us by the wonderful American soprano Renee Flynn. Next week, we're going to have music inspired by plants. That's the second part of our course. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here and hopefully hear any comments any of you might have.
Can you just call on it? Can
All
I
right,
say
my
something?
friends, you are all unmuted. You can ask your questions.
Can I say something? It's Judy. Can you hear?
Sure.
Okay. Just a couple things. This has been wonderful because water, sunrise, sunsets is kind of, you know, what turns me on more than mountains and a lot of other things. So this was special. Beautiful, beautiful music. Okay, so Strauss, Thus Spoke, the movie, what was it?
Oh, come on.
2001.
Yeah, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
And by the way, there was a second excerpt we heard today, which was also featured in that movie. So for extra credit.
Anybody?
It's been too long since you've seen the movie, I can tell.
Yes.
What was that? It was The Beautiful Blue Danube by Strauss. That was also featured.
Oh,
Really?
oh.
Really?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I could do this course.
Well, and I recall that Rusalka was performed here by the Lyric Opera maybe 2 seasons ago. Very nice production of that.
Yes, it's a beautiful piece. The whole thing's beautiful.
Yes.
I have another question. You know, when we talk about these composers from how many, you know, 100 or some years ago, we talk about child prodigies. He was a child prodigy. Normally he's, we don't talk about child prodigies anymore. Is that because most musicians are, or? Yeah, I mean, child prodigies.
I'd be interested in other people's thoughts. I don't know. I mean, the 2 most famous child prodigies in music are Mozart and Mendelssohn.
Exactly.
But there have been many others, Bizet and others, who at a young age have been really astonishing talents. But I'm not sure, now that you've mentioned it, Judy, that I can think of any composers in the last 50 or 60 or 70 years who've been famous as child prodigies. Maybe there are too many distractions. I don't know.
Okay, interesting. I guess I'm thinking about musicians, of which there are many. Pianists.
Well, there are musicians. There are many.
Yeah.
There are many violinists
Yeah.
and pianists and so forth who,
Right.
who are wonderful players even at the age of 5, 6, 7 years old. Oh, there's still a lot of that. There always has been that.
Yeah.
But in terms of composers, I see Michelle and Chuck Ritter have joined us. Michelle knows quite a bit about music. Maybe she can think of something, but I'm not aware of any composers in the last century, let's say, who were famous for being really prodigious composers at a young age.
Nope.
And Madam, you can think about child prodigies. Can you think of other child prodigies in other fields? Painters, writers, sculptors, dancers, I don't know.
Well, nowadays, you know, they all have the privilege of starting so young. And, you know, I'm sure, you know, all those many years ago, they kind of had to probably be born into a family for one thing. And so it's much more, it's broader across the board. I'm thinking of dancers, probably started very young.
And perhaps not as many distractions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is back in the days before kids played soccer. And the 2 examples we're thinking of, Mozart and Mendelssohn, both came from very musical families. So that may be part of it too. Mendelssohn, by the way, had a sister, Fanny Mendelssohn, who was also a phenomenally talented composer and musician. And one of these days, I'd like to put together a course about women composers, and we'll feature, among others, Fanny Mendelssohn, who wrote some great music on her own.
Right.
Speaking of families, Don, what is the relationship between Johann and Richard Strauss?
None.
None?
It's a great question, though.
Okay.
Strauss is a very common name in Austria.
Yeah.
It's like Smith here. And so you see lots and lots of Strausses. And so that's a question often asked, and it's a good question. But Richard Strauss was not from the same line as Johann Strauss at all.
Okay. Wasn't sure.
Yeah, good question.
curious about Mendelssohn. What was his attraction to go to Scotland and write about the Isles?
Well, he traveled a lot. He was from a relatively wealthy family. He went to Italy, he went to France, he went to, of course, all throughout Germany, but he loved England in particular. I think actually he had been invited to England as a young man to conduct some performances of his pieces with various English orchestras. And he composed and even performed in front of Queen Victoria. Not Queen Victoria, would have been an earlier queen. At any rate, he was in England, and so while he was there, he took advantage to go to Scotland, which he'd always heard about. And he was very inspired by Scotland and just loved Scotland. So, yeah, good question.
What were some of the Christian music that he wrote?
Well, he wrote his fourth symphony is called the Reformation Symphony, and it's a story about the Reformation, and he uses themes of hymns, actually, as themes for his Reformation Symphony. So that's the most famous piece. Although he also wrote some oratorios. He wrote an oratorio called Paulus, which is based upon the life of St. Paul, for example, performed in Protestant churches, mostly, I guess it would have been, Lutheran churches, since he was from Germany. So he composed several oratorios for church performance too.
That's very interesting.
Mendelssohn wrote a number of hymns that are sung often in the Lutheran Church, and I think probably other denominations as well. So
yeah, that's a really good point. The next time you're in church, look in the back of your hymnal, and they have an index of hymns by composer, and look up Mendelssohn, and you'll find hymns by Mendelssohn.
Yes.
You can also find hymns by Sibelius. You can find, of course, lots of hymns by Bach, Brahms. Many of the famous classical music composers wrote hymns. One of my favorites, although we haven't featured him so far in this course, is the English composer Sir Arthur Sullivan, Gilbert and Sullivan fame. Of course, he was famous for writing comic operettas, but he also wrote hymns. Look in your hymnal and you will find hymns by Arthur Sullivan. It's the same guy.
Wow.
Other questions about the class for Dawn?
Just can't wait till next week.
Yes, thank you so
Yes.
much.
Very good class.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.